How homes looked. During the Black Death 700 years ago. 700 years ago, the world as people knew it was ending. Not in fire, not in war, but in silence. The silence of entire households that stopped making noise overnight. The silence of streets where children once played. The silence of doors that no one ever opened again. This is the story of what life looked like inside those homes, behind those doors, during the most devastating catastrophe humanity has ever faced. And what you are about to discover will change the way you see every old building, every ancient village, and every medieval painting you have ever come across. To understand what homes looked like during the Black Death, we first need to step inside the world of the 14th century. The year is 1347. Europe is a continent of contrasts. Grand cathedrals rise above cities like Paris, Florence, and London, their spires reaching toward the heavens as if trying to escape the filth below. Because below those spires, the reality is something entirely different. The average European city in the mid-1300s is a cramped, chaotic, overwhelming place. Streets are narrow, sometimes no wider than the span of two outstretched arms. Buildings lean toward each other from opposite sides of the road, their upper floors jutting out so far that neighbors on the second story could almost shake hands across the gap. Sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air is thick with the smell of livestock, of refuse, of smoke from cooking fires, and of human waste that is simply tossed from windows into the streets below. Now picture the homes themselves. For the vast majority of people, a home is not what we imagine today. There are no separate rooms for sleeping, cooking, and gathering. There is no plumbing, no glass in the windows, no closets, no privacy. A typical peasant dwelling in England or France during this period is a single-room structure known as a longhouse. It is built with a timber frame, the gaps between the wooden beams filled with a mixture of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. A technique called wattle and daub. The roof is thatched with straw or reeds, layered thick to keep out rain, though it rarely keeps out everything. Inside, the floor is bare earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that is changed out only when it becomes unbearably soiled. The most striking feature of these homes, the one detail that shocks modern observers the most, is that humans and animals live together under the same roof. One end of the longhouse is reserved for the family. The other end houses their livestock, their cows, pigs, chickens, and goats. There is no wall dividing them. The warmth of the animals actually helps heat the home during the bitter winters, and keeping livestock inside also protects them from theft. But it means the air inside these homes is heavy with the smell and presence of animals at all times. Fleas, lice, and rodents move freely between the animal side and the human side. This detail, seemingly minor in the daily grind of medieval life, will become devastatingly important once the pestilence arrives. Furniture is minimal. A wooden table, perhaps a bench, a chest for storing valuables or clothing. Beds as we know them do not exist for common people. Families sleep on straw-filled sacks laid on the floor or on simple wooden platforms raised just slightly above the damp earth. They sleep together, parents and children, sometimes multiple generations, sharing body heat and blankets made of rough wool. Candles are a luxury. Most families rely on the central hearth for both light and warmth. The hearth sits in the middle of the room, and smoke rises through the space, eventually escaping through a hole in the roof or simply lingering inside, coating the walls and ceiling with a dark layer of soot. There are no chimneys in most homes of this era. The constant smoke gives everything a grey, darkened appearance and fills the lungs of everyone inside. Windows, where they exist, are small openings in the walls, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or thin animal hide to let in some light while keeping out the worst of the wind. Glass windows are reserved for churches and the homes of the wealthy. For everyone else, the choice is between light and warmth, because an open window means a cold room. Now consider the cities. In a place like London in 1347, the population is somewhere around 70 to 100,000 people, packed into an area that would seem impossibly small by modern standards. Houses are built side by side, sharing walls, often sharing roofs. Entire families live in single rooms above shops or workshops. A tanner lives above his tanning pit, the smell of treated hides seeping through the floorboards. A baker lives behind his oven. A butcher sleeps steps away from where carcasses hang. There is no separation between work and home, between commerce and rest. The city is alive with noise and smell and movement during the day, and at night it falls into an uneasy darkness, lit only by the occasional lantern or the glow of a hearth through an open doorway. In wealthier households, the situation is better, but only by degree. A merchant or minor noble might have a home with 2 or 3 rooms, the walls plastered and perhaps even painted with simple designs. They might have actual beds with wooden frames and curtains for privacy, a luxury that is both practical and symbolic. Their floors might be laid with tiles or wooden planks instead of bare earth. They might have a separate kitchen, though it is still primitive by any modern measure. But even in these finer homes, the same fundamental realities apply. Rats nest in the walls, fleas infest the bedding, sanitation is almost non-existent, chamber pots are emptied into the streets or into the nearest river, the same river from which drinking water is drawn. This is the world that exists on the eve of the greatest catastrophe in human history. A world of close quarters, shared air, shared beds, shared fleas. A world perfectly designed, though no one knows it yet, for the rapid and unstoppable spread of disease. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal, because what you are about to hear in the next chapters will reveal details about medieval life that most history books never tell you, and every single video here is crafted to make you see the past in a way you have never seen it before. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. The pestilence arrives in Europe in October of 1347, carried aboard trading ships that dock at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors on board are already afflicted. Many are beyond help. The ships are ordered to leave the harbor, but it is too late. The disease has already stepped onto land, and it moves faster than anyone can imagine. Within weeks, it spreads across Sicily. Within months, it reaches the Italian mainland, then southern France. By the spring of 1348, it is moving through Europe like a wave, reaching city after city, village after village. By the summer, it has arrived in England. By the following year, it is in Scandinavia, in the German states, in the Iberian Peninsula. No corner of Europe is spared. Now here is where the story of homes becomes truly haunting. Because when the pestilence reaches a city or a village, the home becomes the epicenter of everything. It becomes the place where people fall ill, the place where families try desperately to care for their loved ones, and more often than not, the place where they perish. Consider a typical household in Florence in the spring of 1348. Florence is one of the great cities of Europe, a center of banking, art, and commerce. Its population is roughly 100,000. The household belongs to a wool merchant named, let us say, Giacomo. He lives with his wife, their 4 children, his elderly mother, and 2 servants in a stone house near the Arno River. The house is nicer than most. It has 3 levels, with a shop on the ground floor, living quarters on the second, and sleeping chambers on the third. The walls are thick, the windows fitted with wooden shutters. By the standards of the time, it is a comfortable home. When the first rumors of the sickness reach Florence, Giacomo does what many merchants do. He tries to protect his household. He orders the servants to keep the doors closed. He stops going to the market himself, sending a servant instead. He buys extra supplies, stores grain and dried goods, and tells his children to stay inside. But the pestilence does not care about closed doors. It comes in on the back of a flea, carried by a rat that has found its way into the grain stores in the cellar. No one notices. No one could notice. The flea bites one of the servants, a young woman who sleeps on the ground floor near the shop. Within days, she develops a fever. Swellings appear on her neck and under her arms. She is in agony, unable to move, burning with heat. Giacomo's wife tends to her, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, praying over her. Within 3 days, the servant is gone. And now, the tragedy accelerates. Because in the confined space of a medieval home with no understanding of how disease spreads, caring for the sick means condemning yourself. Giacomo's wife, who held the dying servant's hand, who breathed the same air in that small, closed, Room begins to show symptoms 2 days later. Then the youngest child who slept beside her mother. Then Giacomo's elderly mother. One by one, the household falls. Giacomo watches his family collapse around him, powerless to stop it, unable to even understand what is happening. The scene inside the house during these days is almost impossible to imagine. The living and the dying share the same rooms, the same beds. There is nowhere to go. The streets outside are no safer. In fact, they are worse, because the pestilence is everywhere now. Neighbors who were healthy yesterday are being carried out of their homes today. The sounds coming through the walls, through the thin wooden shutters, are sounds of grief, of panic, of desperate prayer. Bodies remain in homes for days because there is no one to remove them. The systems that normally handle the deceased, the church, the grave diggers, the burial guilds, are overwhelmed. In some cities, the bodies of the perished are simply placed outside the front door, left on the street for whoever might come to collect them. Giovanni Boccaccio, the great Italian writer who lived through the pestilence in Florence, described seeing bodies stacked outside homes like merchandise waiting to be picked up. He wrote about how the dignity of the departed was lost entirely, how people who had lived respectable, honored lives were simply discarded. Inside the homes of the wealthy, the situation is marginally better only in that there is more space. A rich family might be able to isolate a sick member in a separate room, though this rarely stops the spread. Some wealthy families flee the cities entirely, retreating to country estates, where they hope the open air and distance from the crowded streets will protect them. This is, in fact, the premise of Boccaccio's famous work, a group of young nobles who flee Florence and tell stories to pass the time while the city suffers below. But even in the countryside, the pestilence follows. It travels along trade routes, in the clothes and belongings of refugees, in the rats that infest every barn and storehouse. The changes that the pestilence brings to the interior of homes are dramatic and immediate. Doors that once stood open to welcome neighbors and customers are now barricaded shut. Windows are sealed with cloth and wax in the mistaken belief that the disease travels through bad air, through the so-called miasma that hangs over cities. People burn herbs and incense inside their homes, filling the rooms with smoke in an attempt to purify the air. Rosemary, juniper, thyme, anything with a strong scent, is burned or scattered on the floors. Some households place bowls of vinegar in every room, believing the sharp smell will drive away the sickness. The concept of quarantine begins to take shape during this period, though the word itself comes slightly later. In the city of Ragusa, on the Adriatic coast, officials decree that arriving travelers must wait in isolation for 30 days before entering the city. This is one of the first organized public health measures in European history, but within individual homes, a kind of informal quarantine is already happening. Families lock themselves inside. They refuse to open their doors. They peer out through cracks in the shutters at a world that is collapsing around them. And here is a detail that truly captures the horror of the domestic experience during the pestilence. In many households, the healthy begin to abandon the sick. Parents leave children, husbands leave wives. It is not cruelty, not exactly. It is pure animal terror. The instinct to survive overrides every bond of love and duty. Boccaccio describes this with a kind of stunned sorrow, noting that the natural affection between family members seemed to dissolve in the face of the disease. Brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister abandoned brother, and very often wife abandoned husband, he wrote. And what was even worse, and almost unbelievable, was that fathers and mothers refused to tend their children, as if they had not been theirs. If this story is making you think about how fragile human connections can be in the face of crisis, write in the comments right now. The past still teaches us. I want to know if you feel the weight of these stories the way I do. As the months drag on and the pestilence continues its relentless march across Europe, the very nature of the home begins to change. It is no longer simply a place to live. It becomes a fortress, a hospital, a morgue, and for many a tomb. In the English countryside, the impact on peasant homes is particularly devastating. Remember those longhouses where families live alongside their animals. When the pestilence strikes a rural household, The results are swift and total. A family of 6 or 7, living and sleeping in a single room, sharing every breath, has almost no chance of avoiding infection once one member falls ill. Entire families are wiped out within a week. Their animals, left unattended, wander out of the open doorway and into the empty fields. The hearth goes cold. The straw on the floor begins to rot. The house stands silent. Across England, hundreds of villages simply ceased to exist during the years of 1348 and 1349. These are not towns destroyed by fire or war. They are simply emptied. Every person gone. The homes remain standing, at least for a while, their roofs slowly sagging, their walls gradually returning to the earth from which they were built. Archaeologists have identified over 1,000 of these lost villages in England alone, places where the outlines of homes and streets can still be traced in the landscape, ghostly patterns in the grass. In the cities, the transformation of domestic life is different but equally profound. As the pestilence rages, the social structures that support urban life begin to collapse. Markets close because there are not enough merchants to run them and not enough customers to buy from them. Workshops fall silent. The rhythm of daily life, the opening of shutters at dawn, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, the cries of street vendors, all of it fades. Inside the homes that still have living occupants, a strange new reality takes hold. People begin to mark their doors. In some cities, a red cross is painted on the door of a home where someone is sick, a warning to passers-by. In others, bundles of straw are hung from the doorframe. These markers serve a dual purpose. They warn others to stay away, and they signal to the authorities, such as they are, that assistance is needed, though assistance rarely comes. The interiors of homes begin to reflect the desperation of their inhabitants. Normal routines of cleaning and maintenance are abandoned. Why sweep the floor when you might not be alive tomorrow? Why repair the shutter when there is no one left in the neighborhood to notice? The rushes on the floor, which in normal times would be changed every few weeks, are left to accumulate layers of filth. The central hearth, which should be tended and fed, is allowed to die in homes where there is no one strong enough to gather wood. Food becomes a crisis within the crisis. With markets closed and supply chains broken, families are forced to rely on whatever they have stored. Grain rots in barrels because there is no one to bake it into bread. Animals that should be slaughtered for food are instead left to die of neglect. In some accounts, people resort to eating whatever they can find, including food stores that have been contaminated by the very rats that carry the disease. The cruel irony of the medieval home, that the food storage attracts the rats that bring the fleas that carry the pestilence, is a cycle that no one in the 14th century can understand or break. Water, already a problematic resource in medieval cities, becomes even more dangerous. Wells are contaminated by the runoff from streets where waste and worse accumulate. Rivers that serve as both water supply and sewage system become even more toxic. Inside the home, the water stored in barrels and jugs is often stale, sometimes green with algae. But it is all there is. The psychological toll of living inside these homes during the pestilence is something that contemporary accounts describe with haunting clarity. Imagine being locked inside a small, dark, smoke-filled room with the knowledge that the people you love most, say in the world, are falling ill around you, that you may be next and that there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The sense of helplessness is total. Medieval people believed the pestilence is a punishment from God, a divine judgment for humanity's sins. This belief adds a crushing spiritual weight to the physical suffering. You are not just sick, you are being punished. Your home is not just a house, it is a cell in which you await your sentence. Some people respond to this despair with wild extremes of behavior. They throw open their doors and live recklessly, eating and drinking to excess, spending whatever money they have, because what good is saving when tomorrow may never come? Others retreat into extreme piety, praying for hours on end, whipping themselves in an attempt to atone for whatever sins have brought this catastrophe upon them. Groups of flagellants roam from town to town, entering cities in processions of self-punishment, their arrival often coinciding with fresh outbreaks of the disease because they carry it with them from place to place. But most people simply endure. They sit in their homes in the semi-darkness, listening to the sounds of a world coming apart around them, and they wait. They wait for the sickness to come or to pass. They wait for news from neighbors, from relatives, from anyone. They wait for the church bells to ring, counting the tolls that mark each new passing. And when the bells finally fall silent, it is not because the pestilence has ended. It is because there is no one left to ring them. The physical structures of homes also begin to suffer. Without maintenance, roofs leak, walls crack, doors hang loose on their hinges. In cities where fires break out, as they often do in densely packed urban areas, there are not enough people to fight them, and entire blocks burn unchecked. The cityscape itself begins to change, gaps appearing in what were once continuous rows of buildings, like teeth missing from a jaw. And then there is the matter of what happens to homes after their inhabitants are gone. In many cases, these homes are simply left empty. No one wants to enter them. No one wants to touch the possessions of the deceased, the clothing, the bedding, the personal items that might carry the disease. These abandoned homes become a common feature of the post-pestilence landscape, standing empty for months or even years, slowly decaying, their contents untouched and rotting within. In some cities, authorities eventually organize the cleaning and repurposing of these homes. The contents are burned. The walls are whitewashed with lime, which is believed to purify the space. The rushes and straw are removed and replaced. But in rural areas, abandoned homes are often simply left to collapse. The timber is occasionally salvaged by survivors, used to repair their own homes or to build new structures. The land on which the houses stood is gradually reclaimed by nature, the walls disappearing. Under climbing vines and grasses, the hearthstones sinking into the softening earth. By 1351, the first and most devastating wave of the pestilence has largely passed through Europe, though it will return again and again in subsequent decades, each time finding new victims among those born since the last outbreak. The continent is transformed. Estimates vary, but most historians believe that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population has perished. In some regions, the figure is even higher. Entire communities have vanished. The social fabric has been torn apart and will never be reassembled in quite the same way. And the homes, those cramped, dark, smoky, animal-shared spaces that were both the setting and the engine of so much suffering, they too are about to change. The massive loss of life creates a paradox. For the survivors, many of whom are peasants and laborers, the world is suddenly full of opportunity. There are fewer people, which means there is more land, more food, and more demand for labor. Wages rise. The rigid feudal system in which peasants are bound to the land and to their lords begins to crack. Workers can now demand better conditions, better pay, and better housing. And they do. In the decades following the pestilence, the quality of housing in Europe improves dramatically. The old longhouses, with their shared human-animal living spaces, begin to disappear. New homes are built with separate rooms for sleeping, cooking, and working. Chimneys become more common, channeling smoke out of the living space instead of letting it fill the room. Floors are raised above the damp earth, built of wooden planks on stone foundations. Windows grow larger, and in some regions, glass becomes available to the middle classes for the first time. The reasons for these changes are complex, but they are rooted directly in the experience of the pestilence. People have learned, at an intuitive, if not scientific level, that the conditions in which they lived contributed to the disaster. They do not understand germs or bacteria, but they understand that filth and crowding are linked to disease. They understand that living with animals in the same room is unhealthy. They understand that fresh air and clean water matter. These lessons, paid for with an almost unimaginable toll of human life, drive the first real improvements in domestic architecture and urban planning in centuries. Cities begin to implement regulations about waste, disposal, about building standards, about the width of streets. The narrow, leaning, claustrophobic streetscapes of the pre-pestilence city slowly give way to wider roads and more open spaces. Public wells are better maintained. Markets are better regulated. It is not a revolution, not overnight, but it is a steady, measurable change that can be traced directly back to the catastrophe. Perhaps the most profound change, however, is not physical, but psychological. The relationship between people and their homes is forever altered by the experience of the pestilence. Before 1348, a home is simply a shelter, a practical necessity, a place to sleep and eat and work. After the pestilence, a home becomes something more. It becomes a place of safety, a refuge from an unpredictable and dangerous world. The desire for privacy, for cleanliness, for separation from the chaos outside. These are post-pestilence values that will shape domestic architecture for centuries to come. The modern concept of home as a private, personal, sacred space has its roots in the trauma of the 14th century. Consider the contrast. Before the pestilence, a peasant family sleeps on straw on a dirt floor, surrounded by their animals, with smoke filling the air and rats running along the walls. A century after the pestilence, the descendants of that family might live in a house with wooden floors, a chimney, separate rooms, and glass in at least some of the windows. Their animals are housed in a separate building. Their beds have frames and mattresses stuffed with wool or feathers instead of straw. It is still humble by our standards, but it is a revolution in comfort and dignity. This transformation is the hidden legacy of the Black Death. We remember the pestilence for its terrifying mortality, for the images of carts piled with bodies, for the doctors in their beaked masks, for the mass graves that archaeologists still uncover today. But the lasting impact of the pestilence is not just in the lives it took. It is in the world it left behind, a world where ordinary people demanded better lives and, for the first time in centuries, had the economic power to get them. The homes of the 14th century, those dark, crowded, fragile structures are long gone. Most have returned to the earth, leaving no trace except in the archaeological record and in the pages of old manuscripts. But their story matters because it reminds us of something fundamental. The spaces in which we live shape who we are. They shape our health, our relationships, our sense of safety and dignity. The people of the 14th century learned this lesson in the hardest way imaginable, and the echoes of that lesson are still with us today, in every home we build, in every door we close behind us, in every moment we take for granted the simple miracle of a clean, safe, private space to call our own. 700 years ago, the world changed behind closed doors. Families, huddled together in the dark, not knowing if morning would bring salvation or sorrow. They lived in homes that were little more than shelters against the rain, sharing their space with animals and vermin, breathing smoke and fear in equal measure. And when the catastrophe passed, when the survivors emerged into a world that was emptier but full of possibility, they began to build something better. Not because they had some grand vision of the future, but because they had seen, in the most brutal and intimate way, what happened when the home failed to protect those within it. That is the story of how homes looked during the Black Death. Not just the physical reality of timber and thatch, of mud floors and smoky hearths, but the human reality of what it means to face the unthinkable inside the walls of your own home. It is a story of loss beyond comprehension, but it is also a story of resilience, of adaptation, of the stubborn human insistence on building something better from the wreckage of the worst. If you are watching this and feeling the weight of this history, if you are looking at the walls around you right now with a new sense of gratitude, then hit the like button and share this video with someone who loves history. Because stories like these deserve to be heard and remembered. If you have watched this far, it is because this story moved you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week we bring you stories from the past that change the way you see the present. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering the people who lived and endured inside those ancient walls 700 years ago.